Hello and good morning, everyone. In Florida, this is Ray Cronin from Club Benchmarking. We are doing this week's Florida chapter webinar on best practices in capital planning. And I'm looking forward to it. Happy to dive in. We're going to go, as we sometimes do, into some, gory detail. But if you have any questions or comments, I should have asked Beth and Sherry, but I'll do it live now. Are they able to raise their hand, Beth? Toss a comment out verbally?
Yes, they can put it in the chat and we will go ahead and monitor those. And at the end, we'll read you the questions.
Okay, so if you have them, if they come in, Beth, you can ask them. If you see it come in, feel free to ask it in real time too.
Okay, yes, sir. Have fun.
Yeah, I like to take the questions in real time. It keeps people engaged. So what we're talking about is best practice in capital planning. We are very focused on this topic, and I'm going to get into why we're focused on it and what that means in some detail. But as I said, if you have any questions, please, just jump in through the chat window, and Beth or Sherry will yell it out to me, and I'll try to answer it in real time. So why are we so focused on capital planning? And the reason is we've learned through research that it's critically important. It's really a critical driver of the financial outcome in clubs. And I won't say that clubs don't capital plan. I would say they do, but I would say the approach that's taken generally and the quality of the approach across the industry, I'm not speaking to any specific club, but across the industry, is lacking. Now, one might say, well, if it's so poor, why are clubs thriving? And it's a very good question. And clubs are thriving because we think two reasons, but one, obviously, the lingering impact of the pandemic, but two, there is a demographic shift underway as the millennials come of age. It will help clubs. We believe that from 2000 to 2020, there was a significant decline in the number of prospective 42-year-olds who could join a club. That's the average age to join a club. From 2023 through 2032 or three, let's say the next decade, the number of 42-year-olds is going to increase. So we think that it's a positive sign and a potential tailwind for the industry. But I also believe that it makes capital planning ever more important. And we're going to get into the why in some detail. So, our company studies finances, as I think everyone knows, amongst other things, but we're very focused on finance. And for the first 7 years or so, we did what I think the industry did and still does to this day. We focused on the income statement / operating ledger. But beginning at the end of 2015, we began to focus, and there's reasons for it. I won't go into them now, but it was related to working with clubs. We began to focus on the balance sheet and the capital ledger. And everything that we're going to talk about this morning and all that we've learned in that regard is a result of that focus on the balance sheet and the capital ledger. And it's led us to where we are. It's led us to this juncture to talk about the best practices in capital planning. The club industry, even with the benefit of the pandemic, is still in this state. About a quarter of the clubs are in what we would refer to as the green bucket, about a quarter in what we refer to as the red bucket, and about half are in between in the yellow bucket. I think that the characteristics that separate ultimately the red and the green is this: it's a mindset within the club, but it's the ability to embrace change ultimately. Red bucket clubs get stuck. Everyone in the industry knows that clubs can get stuck because you may have been in a club that got stuck, or whether you work there or you've been in one visiting for an education session or whatever. But the clubs that are stuck, it's pretty easy to recognize them making our way around the industry. They're the ones that look all old and tattered. They're the ones that don't have the new services and amenities. They don't have fitness. They don't have wellness. They don't have that modern casual dining amenity. And the Green Bucket clubs are very dynamic. They embrace change. They have the modern services and amenities. They don't look depreciated and depleted. They look new. They feel new. They smell new. And then you get, the half of the industry somewhere in between. And the why that goes across this in the middle part of the three buckets here relates to the balance sheet. And ultimately, red bucket clubs have weak balance sheets and green bucket clubs have strong balance sheets. And then those yellow buckets are somewhere in between. And we're going to talk about it in detail here in a minute. I'm just going to give you the punchline. The balance sheet of a club is related to capital income and capital investment, period. It's not related financially to the operations. Financially, it's related to the capital ledger. The capital ledger and the strength of the balance sheet are related to how compelling the member experience is, meaning red bucket clubs tend to have weak balance sheets because they have a lackluster member experience, whereas green bucket clubs have a very dynamic and uplifting member experience. It's something that people want to engage in. So to discuss capital, we have to go back, and I know there's a few people on the webinar today. I did a webinar for the last 3 weeks, once a week for the Club Spa and Fitness Association. I think there's a couple of people on today from that webinar. And some of you may have seen, some or heard of this before. It's a little different, but if it sounds repetitive, it's okay. In my view, repetition is the way we learn. We have to truly understand the business model and the financial model of the industry we're in. This fundamental issue wraps every club and many of the new volunteer leaders in clubs around the axle. So what this distribution shows, it's for 2022. I'm only showing clubs with golf at the moment, but the exact same pattern exists for clubs without golf. At this point, we have 406 clubs with golf in our database for 2022 results. So this is no pandemic income, no ERTC, none of that stuff. The industry is kind of landed right back where it was before the pandemic in terms of the KPIs and the ratios, in the absence of the government income that showed up during the pandemic. But what we need to understand in terms of the business model of clubs are these things. These are the key concepts that are critical. Clubs are high fixed cost businesses. There's very little variable cost in operating a club. And those costs relate to the size of the club's footprint, the breadth of the scale and breadth of the services and amenities we offer. Is it, for instance, 18 holes, 36, 54? Is it a small bathtub pool or a resort style pool with a separate splash pad and a separate swimming pool, for exercise? Is there a fitness and wellness center? Is it 5,000 square feet or 40,000 square feet? Is there one dining venue or 6 dining venues? Is there a marina? So all of those things contribute to the scale of the footprint and the breadth of the services and amenities. And then finally, the level of service and quality. The dining venues open 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, or are they only open 2 days a week, 6 hours a day? These are all choices that different clubs make. Some of the residential community clubs in Southeast and Southwest Florida, you're in the middle of it. In the height of the season from, let's say, December through May, are operating multiple dining venues 7 days a week, many hours a day. So those are the decisions that drive expenses. It's the scale and the breadth of the footprint. And the thing that we have to understand, because the data makes it clear, and it's completely contrary to a lot of times the way volunteer leaders come in and think about the club. Expenses aren't bad, they're good. We don't want lower expense, we want higher expense. Now, that doesn't mean just throw money away. That's not the point. We're talking about being effective. We're not just talking about wasting money, but it's the expenses that drive the member experience. So if you look at the operating expense per full member equivalent, and you look at some of the key attributes of KPIs that relate to capital planning, ultimately, and whether or not we've aggregated and invest properly, aggregated the right capital, invested properly. This lays the two together. So this is nationwide, industry-wide. It just shows the operating expense per full member equivalent in its 2022 year-end data. So a quarter of the clubs had operating expenses of 14,000 or less, as you can see here, and a quarter of the clubs have operating expense of, I'm rounding, 25,000 or higher. If you look at the net worth of the clubs with the lower expense at the median, there's about 100 clubs per quartile. So there's about 100 clubs in the lower quartile and 100 in the upper. 406 across the whole distribution. In the lower quartile, where the expenses are lowest, the median net worth is 7.6 million. In the quartile where the expenses are the highest, the median net worth is 20 million. So 3 times higher. If you look at the net worth on a full member equivalent basis, so the net worth per full member equivalent, in the lower quartile, it's 14,000. In the upper quartile, it's 46,000. If you look at the median initiation fee, and this is 22 data, so this has been positively impacted by the pandemic. The median initiation fee in this group of 100 clubs is 10,000. I'll call it a paltry 10,000. In this quartile, it's 90,000. It's 9 times higher. I just did this data today. This is fresh data. We look at the net to gross property, plant, and equipment ratio. Under 40% means that the club is squarely in the red bucket. There's probably no ambiguity there. The median net to gross PP&E ratio in the clubs with the lowest operating expense, the proportion of the 100 clubs in this quartile that have a red flag net to gross is 35. It's only 10 in the upper quartile. And you can see the median net to gross PP&E ratio is 52 in the upper quartile. It's only 44 below, meaning these clubs have a significantly more deferred maintenance than these. 8 percentage points doesn't sound like a lot, but please remember it's 8 percentage points on 44. That's 20%. That's a 20% delta. So these clubs are in fact the red bucket clubs. The clubs with the highest operating expenses are the red bucket clubs. In the clubs with the lowest operating expenses are the red bucket clubs. That's it. The point is that the money isn't wasted. The money goes to the member experience. It just goes to what I just said at the outset. Covering the cost of operating a broader footprint with more services and amenities, with a higher level of quality, more availability in terms of operating hours and in terms of venues. It's that simple. In the end, the net worth over time, as we've talked about in the past, we believe is the most critical financial metric. And over time, these clubs have amassed at the median 20 million in net worth, and these clubs have only amassed 8, which is kind of indicative of culture. Clubs get stuck in their culture. These clubs are trying to compete on price, the ones with the low expenses. They think that's the key to success. These clubs are trying to compete on the experience they offer. So these clubs in the upper quartile are getting it right, and the clubs in the lower quartile, to be frank, are not getting it right. Couple of more metrics that relate to that. The lower quartile, the median operating margin is 5%. It's a little bit higher than I expected it to be. Normally, it would be right inside the break-even zone, which is plus or minus 4% in our mind. It's just close to the break-even zone. But these red bucket clubs, because of that low initiation fee, they actually strive to use the operating ledger to drive a surplus so that that surplus is available for capital. And the green bucket clubs are effectively breaking even operationally. As a whole, at the moment, that's a minus 2% operating margin, but that's within the break-even zone the way we look at it. And then when you look at the F&B subsidy, it's twice as high in the green bucket clubs as it is in the red bucket clubs. You know, these clubs still think of F&B, although they're getting better. I think, frankly, that has a lot to do with the data. But they still look at F&B more as a profit center than an amenity. And the green bucket clubs have figured out, all right, food and beverage is an amenity. It's not a profit center. That's the business model. The business model is clubs have high fixed costs and they compete on the experience they offer, not the price they charge. The financial model, which relates directly to understanding capital planning and its importance, this is the whole thing. This is the key, in my view. I've said it many times. Many of you have probably heard me say it. You might be getting sick of it, but I'm going to say it till I'm not talking anymore because it's so critical. It's just understanding the financial driver in clubs, the financial knob. So the blue line, 2022 data. This is all clubs. What I was showing you prior was just clubs with golf. We have just about 500 clubs in the database now. That includes yacht clubs and city athletic clubs. But the industry slid right back to where it was before the pandemic. As I said earlier, this is the data that demonstrates that. So the operating margin, the operating bottom line, which is the income statement, not including depreciation expense and not including capital income. They're on the capital ledger. The median club broke even in 2022, right on the noggin. 0% operating margin. That means they had a break-even outcome. At club benchmarking, we say anything between -4 and +4% operating margin, which is 70% of the clubs. 70% operate in actual outcomes within that break-even zone, as you can see here. So that's exactly the way it looked in 2019 prior to the pandemic. The point is, if the operating ledger is break even, by definition, it's not a financial or the financial driver. It's not. It's not meant to be. The purpose of the operating ledger is to deliver services and amenities to members. It's consumed year in and year out by members enjoying the club. The financial driver is the gold line, which is capital income put into the same context as the operating results. So it's just capital income divided by operating revenue. So the club that broke even right at the median had capital income equal to 18% of the operating revenue. That's the free cash. This gold line, capital income, represents the free cash that clubs have to drive themselves forward financially. That's an important point, and it relates directly to the critical nature of capital planning. Given that capital income is the financial driver, if we want to control our financial outcomes in the future, then what we have to control is the capital plan looking into the future. So this data is what's driven us to focus so heavily on capital reserve studies and capital planning, which we do, because we learned it. We didn't just make it up. We're responding to what we see here. And when you look at the balance sheet, which we've done together before, and it always helps to do it again, there's a couple of critical points. So remember, the operating ledger doesn't include capital income and the depreciation expense. That's on the capital ledger. So if you think about how that impacts the balance sheet, what it means is, given that the the operations break even financially, the contribution to retained earnings, if you will, a profit over time in a club, is related to this equation right here. It's related to how much capital income we have as regards how much depreciation we have. So the members' equity, the net worth of a club, is literally the sum of all the capital income the club has had in its history, minus the sum total of all the depreciation that's occurred in the club's history. And when we look to the asset side of the balance sheet, again, this is up-to-date data, balance sheet data. When we look to the asset side, it just becomes so clear and logical that 74% at the average club, 74% of what the average club owns is the net book value of property, plant, and equipment after depreciation. So after all the accumulated depreciation on the assets we own, we're left with the net book value of those assets. And that represents 74% of what a club has. If you add cash, that gets you to 90% of the assets. So only two line items on the balance sheet represent 90% of what a club owns. So clearly, protecting and understanding what lays beneath this property, plant, and equipment is a strategic endeavor. And what lays beneath that is this: two things. The assets that we own, which are reflected by obligatory capital. So the assets the club already owns, which need to be repaired and replaced on a regular, never-ending, perpetual basis. And then aspirational capital, which is the growth capital we add over time in clubs. So in Florida, in particular, in residential community clubs, over the last, let's say, 10, 12 years, as many of you have undergone a significant evolution in terms of your pools, your casual dining, your fitness and wellness, and your golf course, because a lot of you have renovated or redone your golf courses. So those additions of new services and amenities or expanded services and amenities, that's aspirational capital. But both of those things end up manifesting themselves on your balance sheet, and everyone needs to really dig in and understand their balance sheets in this regard. This is just a balance sheet. It's a real club's balance sheet that's protected in the name. I use this balance sheet to teach BMI 3, which I think is the BMI general manager session at Michigan State. And if you look, what your balance sheet will show, and it will show it in one of two ways, is your net property, plant, and equipment under assets. So in the case of this club, they actually show not just the net, they show the gross, the total accumulated depreciation, and then construction in progress. You will either see on your balance sheet just the net number or this type of an approach. If you see just the net number on your balance sheet, the rest of it, the gross PP&E, the total accumulated depreciation, et cetera, is in a note at the back of the audited statements. So there'll be a note that there's two notes that relate to property, plant, and equipment. One will relate to the depreciation policies for your various assets, buildings, furniture, fixtures, and equipment, mechanicals like irrigation or HVAC, that type of stuff. And the other note will actually delineate, just as it does here, the values for the gross PP&E and the accumulated depreciation. That will be on every audited statement. Now, what we've just learned is that net PP&E, if you will, anchors the balance sheet. It's the focus. It's 75% of what we own. So it's critically important. And the way we look at balance sheets, and if we go, I'm not going to go back, but when we're looking at the red, yellow, and green bucket clubs, you recall on the Red Bucket Club, it said weak balance sheets, and the Green Bucket Club, it said strong balance sheets. What a weak balance sheet means is deferred capital investment in high debt. So what that means is the net PP&E has a ratio to the gross PP&E that's low because there's all the assets in place are significantly depreciated because we haven't replaced them regularly enough. So they look worn and depleted, and it shows up on the balance sheet. And when you find clubs like that, and again, that's about a quarter of the industry, you tend to find those are the clubs, ironically, that have the most debt as well. And it's because they are afraid ultimately to ask their members for the capital that's necessary to repair and replace the assets that they have. That's what's happening. So that's what a weak balance sheet results in. Deferred capital investment in the 75% of the assets that are owned in that line item, right here, property and equipment, land, property and equipment. A strong balance sheet is just the opposite. There's not deferred maintenance, so the net book value is closer to the gross because there's less depreciation, and then there's less debt, and there's less debt because those clubs that have that money, the capital to reinvest is necessary, have done the capital planning work, have done the work necessary to make sure that their members contribute the money that is necessary to maintain the equipment. I see there's a couple of, yeah.
Can I ask a couple of questions? The one question is, are you concerned with the low sample size as we have a couple thousand private clubs in the industry, in the country?
The low sample size, say that again, please.
Are you worried about the low sample size as we have a couple thousand private clubs in the country?
Yeah, no, so we end up, when we end 2022, collecting that data, we'll have about 1,000 clubs worth of data. We use 3,500 as the number that we use for the market at large. When we have over, I think it's 363 clubs, we have confidence levels of 90% or greater with margins of error of plus or minus 5%. So this data with 492 clubs, 500 clubs worth of data. The balance sheet, by the way, just to be clear, is trend data. So we accumulate, that's 22, and that's actually just 22, but there's 1,000 clubs of balance sheet data. We don't have all the trial balances. So this data is statistically significant, and it represents to a high degree of accuracy and confidence the industry at large. And that's why I'm willing to put the numbers out. A lot of times you'll see data, but you don't see how many clubs are actually in the sample set. I'm showing you at every juncture how many clubs are in the sample set.
Fantastic. Thank you. One more question. Are we going to be able to share a copy of your PowerPoint presentation with our members?
Yeah, we will send it, Beth, to you and Sherry, and you can disseminate it. We'll send it as a PDF so everyone can have it.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt.
No worries. I'll take them as they come, definitely. So just to get a sense, and back to it's probably kind of ironic, but to the questioner's point about statistics and significance, this is pretty interesting. What you see here on the left is the distribution of gross property, plant, and equipment. It doesn't change quickly. So this is for the 22 and 21. If a club gave us their 22 year-end data, then we don't show their 21. But if they haven't given us their 22 year-end data yet, we're using their 21 year-end data. And I use that for the gross PP&E and net PP&E because that doesn't change dramatically year after year across 900 clubs, which is obviously a huge sample. So the median club, this is all clubs with and without golf across the country, has $24 million worth of gross PP&E. That means that's what we paid for it when we procured it. And the net PP&E is 11. And if you see the difference between the net and the gross, what that represents, that gap, if you will, is the accumulated depreciation across the industry. So you can see it, right? You visibly see it. If we look at just Florida, we have 136 clubs, and look at how similar it is. The gross PP&E at the median is 25 million, and the net is 14. Now, that 14 is a higher percentage of 25 than the 11 is of 24 over here. So just generally, Florida has done a better job, and we're going to see this in some data, of reinvesting in their assets. And there's all sorts of reasons why, which we may talk about as a group. So, but I just want to highlight real quick at the breakpoints, the 25th percentiles, industry-wide, 13, in Florida, 13, industry-wide, 24, in Florida, 24 at the median, industry-wide, 38 at the 75th percentile, in Florida-wide, 38. It's basically identical. So Florida is a pretty representative subset of the entire industry across the country. And the only difference is that when you look at the net PP&E, right across the board, they're higher. And you can just see the gap between the blue and the orange gold line is narrower in Florida, which means they actually, you've done a better job. You have less accumulated depreciation. And on the whole, your clubs have more fresh and up-to-date assets. Okay. Now let's zero in on Florida a bit. So this again is the Florida data I just showed, but I just want to show you the yacht club subsection. We have 24 yacht club data points on this distribution. There's about 37 clubs in the Florida Council of Yacht Clubs, and we're dealing with about 24 of those 37 right there. So back to the question's point about, statistical significance, 24 out of 37 is about 75%, maybe a little less, 65%. And obviously it's a big chunk of the data that does exist. So yacht clubs, as you can see, just the main point here is simply this. A quarter of the yacht clubs are relatively large yacht clubs, 22 million or more of gross assets. But at the median and the 25th percentile, yacht clubs have less property, plant, and equipment. Probably not a surprise. The big difference is golf. Golf is the golf course and the golf course maintenance equipment over a 20-year period consume about half of the capital in the average club. So when you take the golf course away, you just have less assets. But still, yacht clubs need to be cognizant, obviously, of making sure they can properly meet the future. This shows the residential community clubs, which are a much higher proportion of clubs in Florida than they are across the country. So when you look at this data, you'll see the residential community clubs tend to have more property, plant, and equipment, especially at that upper quartile. It's 38 million across the entire state. But when you just look at residential community clubs as a subset, that 75th percentile is 56 million. So what you see in here is you get about a quarter of your residential community clubs. They're really, really large in terms of their footprint, their physical footprint, their property, plant, and equipment. That's probably not a surprise to anyone in the chapter in Florida. So as a whole, the state's assets match the industry at large, but your residential community clubs tend to be bigger even than that. And when you take them and the yacht clubs and the standalone clubs in Florida, you blend them all in, they look just like the industry at large. I want to get into some data, please. And this is just a summary of what we just saw. I'm just focusing on the median now. But if you look across the nation, all clubs, as you saw, gross PP&E is 24 million. In Florida, it's 25. The debt at the median across the country is 2.3. The debt in Florida is 2.6. It's a little bit higher. The depreciation expense is 1.1, and it's 894 across the country. That's because, as we just saw, there's less depreciation, accumulated depreciation in Florida, meaning your depreciation expense is higher, even though your gross PP&E is about the same. One reason being that your assets are fresher, so they're going to have more depreciation. The more depreciated an asset base is, the lower the depreciation expense, because more and more of the assets are fully depreciated. But the key point is this, that given that the gross PP&E is almost identical, the capital, the net available capital, the money that's available at the end of last year, this is 2022 data, the money that's available after covering operations, the money that's available to pay down debt and make capital investments and increase cash reserves is 33% higher in Florida than it is nationally, even though the footprint is similar. That's a really important point. I just want to go through the definitions. Net available capital is all your capital income minus lease expenses, minus interest expense, plus your operating result. I put the operating result in parentheses because, as we saw earlier, it could be negative or positive. Half the clubs it's negative, half it's positive. So if it's negative result, that detracts from net available capital. And if it's a positive result, it contributes to net available capital. And that's the pile of money that clubs have each year to pay down debt, invest in obligatory and aspirational capital, and increase cash reserves. This is the key. It's a key perspective on capital planning. And I'm going really slow. I'm looking at the clock. I got to pick it up. The key perspective is, we talk about the priorities. There's 4. Obviously, debt service has to be covered. Obligatory capital, repair and replacing and taking care of the assets we own is critical, obviously. Adding the new assets as they're necessary is critical. And then if we can, we increase our cash reserves. What happens is red bucket clubs can maybe cover their debt. Well, they can cover their debt service for the most part, but they have a hard time fully penetrating the obligatory capital layer. Yellow bucket clubs can maybe penetrate the obligatory capital layer, but they don't have enough capital to add new assets. And then green bucket clubs have the capital to effectively penetrate all 3 into the cash reserve layer as necessary. So it's just a matter of assuring that the net available capital that we have, this is what capital planning is all about, is proactively planning to assure that year by year for the next 5 or 10 years, we know, looking at it today, that we're going to have enough money every year to penetrate all 4 layers of this hierarchy. That is what capital planning is all about. And I want to introduce you. This is new. I just did this for this webinar. And this is an eye-opener. I checked it 5 times because I had to make sure it was right. Generally speaking, these are the buckets that assets are depreciated over or aggregated. When you look at your audited financials, and that note I mentioned, you're going to see this exact breakout on your audited financials. You're going to have 5 to 7 year assets, 10-year assets, 20 to 25 year assets. I kept it simple. I didn't put the bands. And then 40-year or more assets. So a 7-year assets would be like furniture, fixture, and equipment, some equipment, golf carts, fine turf golf course, maintenance equipment. All right, it could be 5 years, 7 years. I'm not being, that zeroed in right at the moment. Just trying to make a point. 10-year assets would be things like kitchen equipment and HVAC. 25-year assets or 20-year assets would be things like irrigation systems, pools, and roofs. And then 40-year or more assets would be in residential community clubs, the roads that go through the community, the buildings themselves, the clubhouses, the golf course maintenance building, etc. So what capital planning is about is assuring that we are aggregating capital today that meets the needs of the future, but we have to do it based on what the assets are going to cost us in the future, not what they cost us today. So just generally, in this bucket, these assets are like $100,000 level of expense. In this bucket, the 10-year assets, you know, if you replaced all your kitchen equipment or all your HVAC equipment, you're talking more like $1 million. The 25-year assets, they're even more expensive. You replaced all your irrigation system on your golf courses or your pools or your roof. Now you're talking more money. And then finally, the big assets that get depreciated over a long period of time, it's even more money. That's mainly buildings. I put roads in, they can be expensive, but they're long life. Look at this. In today's dollars, when you have to replace this, so in this case, at 3% inflation, if we spent 100 grand today on this stuff and we have to replace it in 7 years, at 3% inflation, we need 123,000. At 5%, we need 141. In the $1 million bucket, it's $1.3 million and $1.6 million, longer time frame. $5 million bucket, it's $10.5 million and 17. And check this one out. In the $20 million bucket, say a new clubhouse, 40 years later at 3% inflation, that clubhouse would cost $88 million. And 40 years later at 5% inflation, it would cost $230 million. And I'm looking at that one. Is that right? That can't be right, but it is right. I checked it. There's a rule of 72, something you might just use as you're in meetings. It's very powerful once you understand it. But all you got to do is divide 72 by whatever the inflation rate is, and that gives you the number of years it takes to double. So at 3%, the rule of 72 divided by 3 is 24. That means $1 accruing 3% interest or $1 of expense accruing 3% inflation will become $2 in 24 years. And then in another 24 years, it will become $4. And then in another 24 years, it will become $8 because it doubles each time. So if you look at this building thing, it's going from 20 to 40 to 80 million at 3%, and it's going from 20 to 40. I'm sorry, 20 to 40 to 80 million in 3 years. I just did the math. The median club in Florida has 600 full member equivalents. If you were trying to accrue to meet those clubhouse needs in the future, you'd have to be accruing 244 per month now for 50 years at 3% inflation and 640 a month starting now at 5% inflation for 50 years. So think about that in terms of your clubhouses, your building, your fitness centers. Think about it in terms of your golf courses, your roads, your docks and seawalls at yacht clubs, which are the expensive assets. The point is, this is why capital planning is so critical, because if we don't think forward, when we have to replace these assets, they're so darn expensive, we have trouble. Everyone's lived through that. Looking at it through another lens, this is just Florida clubs. It's a sample. I did some work for one of the more well-known clubs in Florida a couple of weeks ago, and this is just some of the data that I used. But what this shows is the orange line goes to the left axis, and it shows the total gross property, plant, and equipment. So in the case of this third club, the club has almost $200 million worth of gross PP&E. This club down here has about $50 million worth of gross PP&E. These are big, big numbers. The median club across the whole industry is 25 million, as we saw earlier. Now, the blue bar goes to the right axis, and that's the property, plant, and equipment per full member equivalent. So this one club has total gross PP&E of about 89, it's 90 million. I'm going to round it, 90 million. But they don't have many members. So each of their members is at about 230,000 of PP&E they're responsible for. This other club, it's 210,000 of PP&E per member. They're responsible for that. They're on the hook for it. They're on the hook for keeping it up to date and fresh. And then you can see it drops dramatically. Even though this club got 200 million, it's about 130 grand per FME because they have a lot more FMEs. This club has about 440. The second club, this club has about 1,300. They have a much bigger footprint, but in terms of the second club, the small one, it's a big footprint for 440 members. So every club should know, you should all know, as managers, CFOs, controllers, even as department heads, everyone should know, what does each of our members have on the line in terms of the property, plant, and equipment that we have to maintain at our club? This is eye-opening. And so I'm going to make a segue now. That's background data, but would you ever run your club without a monthly roll-up and assessment of the operating ledger? The answer is no. With the income statement, you do it every month. You have to do it. But do we look at the forward-looking capital plan every month? No, we don't. Capital income and capital investment, as I just showed, is the financial driver of clubs. It is the tens of millions of dollars, but we're worrying about the 38th line item on the income statement and not worrying about the big picture of capital. So does your club have the capital resources necessary to proactively meet its forward-looking capital needs? And how would you know? You know, the words used a lot in Florida, it's used a lot around the industry. We've used it. We're going to change it. We're going to stop using it. Sorry, I just got a call on my Teams. We use the term, we're going to stop using it. You know, capital reserve studies came out of the POA world, or the condominium world. And what they do, they add value, but what they do is they tell a condominium or a POA how much money they have to set aside to meet the replacement of their assets in the future. Obviously, POAs and condos, they have buildings, they got parking lots, they got roofs. They don't typically have golf courses and kitchen equipment and fitness equipment and all of this ancillary, equipment. They might have a pool, but they don't have typically resort style pools. So the reserve study is kind of narrow in that it focuses on a few things. And by the way, it focuses on how much we need, but it doesn't tell us how we're going to get it. Clubs don't need that. Clubs need forward-looking capital plans. They need to understand how much money is necessary to maintain obligatory assets, but they also need to know how much money is necessary for debt service, how much is available for aspirational capital, and then they have to project how they're going to raise this capital. Is it initiation fees? Is it transfer fees? Is it recurring capital dues? Is it operating assessments? What is it? And we need to always know if there's a gap between our projected needs and our projected resources. So what we are proposing or advocating now for the industry is this. When you look at the tools that clubs have to do that forward-looking capital plan, these are generally the three tools that exist. There's a fixed asset register in every club. It shows your account number. It shows you the accumulated depreciation, the original acquisition cost, how much the depreciation expense is per month and per year, and how many months or years the asset will be depreciated over. In a separate spreadsheet, clubs might have a capital plan. The capital plans that I've looked at for most clubs tend to look like this. They're pretty simple. They talk about replacement capital, and it looks like the same number every year. They talk about project or aspirational capital. They project initiation fee income, debt service. But you can see, and this is a typical one, the numbers are all rounded. They're all assumptions that are based on some number that someone pulled out of somewhere. And then the third sheet, if a club has this capital reserve study, quote unquote, it's in a different spreadsheet. There's three spreadsheets kicking around most clubs, and they don't get updated every month. They get updated when a new project is done, or when a new treasurer takes their seat, or when a new CFO or GM comes in. They're sporadically updated, and they're not integrated. Comprehensive asset management is integrating all three of these functions: fixed asset register, the capital plan, and this asset, what we want to start using the term for the club industry, asset inventory, assessment, and replacement cost data. All of that should be in one database. That's integrated capital planning, which allows you to have a forecast that looks like this. Now, this forecast may look familiar to many of you, but I can tell you or assure you that the way this is constructed in a comprehensive manner is entirely different than 99 out of 100 that I've ever seen in the industry. This is a spreadsheet that shows the capital cash flows over a 10-year period, as it should. I don't have to read all the line items, you can see them. But the key to this is not one of the numbers in this spreadsheet was entered into the spreadsheet. Every number is the result of bottoms-up analysis and assumptions. So the cash flow forecast is a result, not the end itself. If you think about your existing capital plan, key questions are, do you have one? Who controls it? How often is it reviewed by the finance committee, management team, and board? How often does it change? What does it include? You know, the kind of the current practices are, I really believe only 10% of clubs have a reasonably substantive forward-looking capital plan. I've looked at hundreds of fixed asset registers, and I know there's a lot of finance executives on this webinar. You know where your fixed asset register is in terms of its completeness. They're pretty spotty. And then the capital planning is done typically as an event. It isn't done as a perpetual process like we roll up the income statement every month. We think that it should be a perpetual process that's updated monthly, that's as familiar as the income statement / operating ledger to everyone, that is driven by bottoms-up assumption. It is not that the data was entered into the spreadsheet. The data results from the assumptions, and that the whole process, it doesn't change when we get a new treasurer or a new CFO or a new president or a new staff member. You know, we think it should cover 10 years of horizon. At minimum, it has to cover 5. And the reason is you can't aggregate capital overnight. The sooner you begin to aggregate it, or we begin to aggregate it, the easier it is to close the gap between the projected needs and resources. As a perpetual process, we believe these are the bottoms-up approach. So every month we should be reviewing our forward-looking assumptions on membership intake and attrition, category by category and year by year over the planning horizon. Every month we should be looking at our cost of belonging and initiation fee assumptions, category by category, year by year, including the recurring capital dues. All of our debt service projections, our asset inventory, useful life assessment, replacement cost database should be continuously updated every month with the additions and disposals that are done as we do capital investments, because we're doing them constantly. Back to condos and the small condos or small POAs, they might do a capital project once a year. Clubs do them constantly, as you know. And then as the strategic plan the club has evolves, it's the strategic plan that drives the aspirational projections, because it's the strategic plan that drives the investments we're going to make in the new asset services and amenities that we offer. So that proper capital planning is not just having a spreadsheet off to the side. It's a systematic process that allows the right tools. there needs almost to be an application specific, there needs to be an application specific platform for this. We believe that's the right tool. And then that platform allows continuous update of asset, the asset database that reflects the reserve study, continuous update of the plans as they change and evolve, the monthly updates of asset additions and disposals, and then regular review and monitoring, like monthly. That's proper capital planning. That's what we're trying to hopefully lead the industry. You know, it's a perpetual process that's continuous, it's dynamic. All those functions I showed earlier are integrated into one database and one platform, and when a change is made, it ripples through to everything. One of the problems the industry has had historically is because of these three islands that I showed earlier, the fixed asset register, the reserve study somewhere else, and the capital plan somewhere else. It's hard for the finance team, which is taxed already, to kind of update all three of those things every time an asset is added or disposed of. But it's necessary. If we're going to have the same level of diligence and control on the capital process that we do on the operating ledger, this is what's required. So that cash flow forecast shouldn't be the end in itself. It shouldn't be what we do the work in. It should reflect the changes that are being made dynamically as the club evolves and closes its books every month. That's the way we can assure that every club is properly penetrating all four layers of that capital hierarchy as we go on. So here's the way this dynamic process evolves from our standpoint. It's what I just summarized. We focus on the resources. The resources include our projected year-by-year operating result. Then we focus on the needs. So that's based on our asset inventory assessment and replacement cost study, AKA capital reserve study. That feeds the obligatory needs year by year. The strategic plan feeds the aspirational needs year by year. The debt service as it is, including any balloons, we can enter into an equation, and we have the mandatory debt service principal and interest we've said we will pay the bank, but most clubs pay additional principal, and most clubs will have a balloon payment. So all of that has to be precisely entered, and then any other capital needs. When we do this, we've done this over 150 times now for clubs across North America. With the one exception, out of 150, I'm rounding clubs, one club had the resources over a 10-year period that had enough resources to meet the needs over a 10-year period. The other 149, when this process is instantiated, what we do, the first step is to define the gap, how much money we need to close the gap between those projected needs and resources. And then we can ask the members for that money starting now so that we know we can meet the needs as we look down the road. And once the gap's identified, it allows the board and the finance committee to figure out, you can run multiple, if you have the right platform and the right process, it's easy to run multiple scenarios, multiple alternatives. What if we increase the initiation fee? What if we increase the recurring capital dues? What if we take on a little more debt? What if the interest rate's different? Those are all assumptions in a modeling exercise. Proper capital planning should allow for multiple strategies or variations to be considered so that we can see all sorts of alternatives, so that we can identify the right alternative, which then becomes what we call our new base case. And once that's established and the members have accepted it, we now have a capital plan without a gap between the needs and the resources. We fund the plan from day one fully, and then we just keep the plan up to date by adding all the obligatory needs and adds as they occur, by updating the replacement costs and inflation assumptions annually. We just saw the huge impact that a 3%, a 5% inflation versus 3% assumption could have on future capital needs. So we do this regularly. We don't do it as an event. We do it systematically as the year unfolds. And then every year, just like we do with the operating ledger, we close it out. We start over, we add the 10th year on, and now we've got a 10-year rolling window that always allows us to know today how much capital we need to meet the needs of tomorrow. It's that simple. This is a sample of 54 clubs that have gone through a comprehensive process like this. And the main difference between what the original base case was, where there's a gap in the funding needs, there's not enough resources to meet the needs. The main difference between that and the strategy that was selected by the board and the finance committee and the planning committee, and then presented to the membership for their acceptance in almost every case, is the difference between about 1,200 and we'll call it $1,300 a year and $2,500 a year. Works out to about $100 per month, full member equivalent on average. Can you imagine the power that has in clubs when all of a sudden, sitting today, you know that you're going to have the capital you need for tomorrow, and all you had to do was ask your members for another $100 a month in recurring capital dues? I want to be clear, that's the average. I don't want to make it sound like every club's going to be that, but that's the difference between proactive capital planning and reactive capital planning is $100 a month. I'm going to close out here, but before I do, I just want to go back to this because I don't know if I made it did a good job of explaining it. But if you had a clubhouse that was built today at $20 million, and we assume either 3% inflation or 5% inflation, and say we're going to replace it in 50 years, 50 years. These are the numbers 50 years out. These are huge numbers. It relates to 250 a month or 650 a month starting now. If a club was to accumulate that capital as it's consumed, as that clubhouse is depreciated by the current members, if they wanted to contribute their obligation back so that the club's accumulating the money necessary, it's a big number. So, and that's only a 2% variation in inflation, a 2 percentage point variation in inflation. Look at the difference. So that's the whole point behind this process, in doing it regularly and doing it monthly, keeping the plan up to date monthly, reviewing it monthly, and updating replacement costs and inflation annually, so that we always have a valid, accurate view, and we always make sure that we're asking the members today for what's necessary to meet the next 10 years of capital. And just, I'll sign off, ask for some questions. I'm a little over, I apologize. But, you know, these are the warning signs, the way we look at it, of improper or inadequate capital planning. First off, it's top down. If you look across your capital plan, if you have one in a spreadsheet, and the same amount of initiation fee income shows up every year, or the same amount of obligatory capital shows up every year, you don't have a capital plan by definition, because they're not going to be the same every year. If you use depreciation as a method of quantifying obligatory capital, that won't work, because as I just showed, replacing assets in future dollars is a heck of a lot more than what we already have them on the books for. If there isn't real aspirational capital in your capital plan, you don't have a plan, because aspirational capital is necessary. Otherwise, we become a red bucket club. If you're planning when new people or projects arise, that's a warning sign. If you think that you have the resources necessary to meet the needs for tomorrow, you are either a 1/2% club, or you probably don't have an accurate plan, because across 150 clubs, we know 99.5% don't have adequate needs, don't have adequate resources to meet the needs. And then finally, if you can't model turning the interest rate knob or the obligatory capital knob or the initiation fee, how much the initiation fee is, or the number of members you have. You can't turn knobs that make assumptions up in a capital plan easily. Then, and you haven't considered a number of alternatives as you look down the road proactively, then it's probably not a proactive capital plan. So with that, I'm gonna stop. That hour went way too fast from my end, but I see there's some more questions or chats potentially. I'm happy to take any questions or comments that exist.
We have some very nice comments, Ray, that say, thank you, you're incredible. Thanks for explaining these terms in terms we can understand. So yeah, that's a very good comment, Michael Nadeau. Thank you for sharing that. I don't see any other questions over here right now, Ray, but I did want to do 2 plugs. The question was there from the standpoint of the sample size. One way to help with the sample size is to get with Club Benchmarking, reach out to Terry Finan and the staff at Club Benchmarking and work with them, get your data into the set and have your club be able to benchmark against that set. So reach out to them and become part of their program is one way. And the second is just another little plug is that in June, we will have our renovation summit at Meisner Country Club after the conference at Opal Grand. And Ray will be participating and going over some of these fine points that he spoke about today in more detail. And when it comes to renovations and being capitally and financially prepared for what it is and how do you get that money, and can do you have a beer budget, or do you beer budget and champagne tastes, and how are you going to get there? So he's going to speak more on that at our renovation summit. We have one more question that came up, Ray, if I can keep you for just another minute. It says, how do you get your finance committee not to worry about financial statements and focus more on capital planning? Very good question, Shane.
I think it's a great question, and I think the answer is by doing this, developing a comprehensive capital planning process that integrates into the monthly rhythm that exists in clubs. That's the point. The clubs that we work with in this process, they build the capital planning review into the monthly rhythm, just like they build. That's the point I made earlier about the operating ledger or the review of the income statement. So, and when it's done the first time, it's so eye-opening. If it's done right, clubs realize how much capital is needed, that it helps focus the volunteer leaders on the important thing, because they realize it's millions and millions of dollars, not thousands of dollars that we're dealing with on the operating ledger to begin with.
Thank you. Just one other question that came out is, how do we get access to the recording and the presentation? Is those will be going out by Friday afternoon. We'll send both a link to the video and also a link to the PowerPoint, which will be housed on the FLCMAA website. So we'll get those out by Friday to everybody. So thank you very, very, very much for participating today. Ray, we thank you for taking this call all the way in Ireland, and we appreciate you making the time for us always. And Terry, always thank you for your help, and we look forward to another session with you very soon. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you in Florida in June.